Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. We're going to be exploring how culture shapes the way we learn. We've got quite a bit to unpack today, academic papers, webinars, expert opinions, and I'm really excited about some of the stuff we uncovered. It's truly surprising, I
Yeah.
think. One anecdote I have to tell you about right away, it really hooked me. An Inuit parent was apologizing to a teacher because their child was speaking up too much in class.
Mm.
What is that about?
It shows you right away how we need to think about culture a little differently. Yes, it's about the food and clothing and all, but it's really about those deep values, those unspoken values that shape how we act, how we interact, how we learn everything.
Okay, so we need to define our terms here. When we
Yeah.
say culture, we're not talking about just the observable stuff. We're talking about the shared values, beliefs, and even those really complex communication patterns that an outsider might not even notice.
Exactly, and those patterns have a huge impact on learning styles. Curry actually defined learning styles as the characteristic behaviors that show us how someone perceives, interacts with, and responds to the learning environment.
Right, and it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Hmm.
One of the sources had this great analogy, thinking about learning styles like an onion.
Uh-huh.
The outer layers might be things like environmental preferences, like needing a quiet space,
Hmm.
or learning best by doing something
Yeah.
hands-on.
Hands-on, right.
But you peel back those layers and you get to those core personality traits, which are tied into those cultural values. For
True.
example, individualism versus collectivism. That's a big one, right?
It's huge.
That shapes how learning happens in a very fundamental way.
Absolutely.
So in more collectivist cultures, like we see traditionally in parts of Asia, there's this big emphasis on group harmony and respecting authority.
Right?
So how does that play out in the classroom?
So in those cultures, you might see students who are hesitant to ask questions because they might feel like they're challenging the teacher or disrupting that harmony. They might be more likely to come up with answers together as a group, prioritizing that group understanding over being recognized as an individual.
That's so different from what a lot of Western educators might be used to,
Yeah.
where questioning and debate is like encouraged.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think about that German exchange student we saw in that YouTube video, totally bewildered by how open the discussions were in that American classroom.
Right. Yeah.
It just shows you how even small cultural differences can lead to those misunderstandings. So we've got individualism versus collectivism. Let's add another layer to this. What about high context versus low context cultures?
Yes.
The unspoken rules. This is where that Inuit parent comes back in. That apology for their child speaking up wasn't because they were disrespectful. It was because in their culture, they place a high value on observation and understanding things implicitly.
Yeah.
In high-context cultures, so much is communicated through nonverbal cues, through the context that you share, and those unspoken rules
Yeah.
that someone from the outside wouldn't even know are there.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a low-context culture like the U.S., direct, explicit communication is valued. You say what you mean, and there's not much room for interpretation.
Right.
So those open classroom discussions and that direct questioning, that would feel natural in the U.S., but it might feel really jarring in a high-context culture.
Yeah, definitely.
So what you're saying is, if you're working with people from a bunch of different cultural backgrounds, you can't just assume everyone learns the same way or communicates the same way.
Oh, absolutely not.
You have to be tuned in to those subtle differences,
Yeah, you do.
and misinterpreting them can have real consequences, like
Yeah.
we saw with that Australian manager.
Yeah.
Struggling with that leadership training program that was designed in Singapore.
That's right.
It just goes to show that even when you have a good program, if it doesn't take into account those cultural contexts of the learners, it might not work. But hold on, isn't there a danger of overgeneralizing here?
You're right. Understanding these big cultural dimensions is helpful, but we can't just stereotype people. You can't assume that everyone from a certain culture will learn or act the exact same way.
Right. It reminds me of that research on the paradox of the Asian learner. There's this stereotype
Mm-hmm.
that students from a lot of Asian cultures are passive, and they just learn by rote memorization, and they don't like critical thinking.
Mm.
But the research shows that that is way too simple.
Absolutely.
Like in Chinese culture, for example,
Right.
memorization is often seen as a way to get to a deeper understanding, like a building block to being able to critically analyze things.
Exactly.
So it's not about just blindly accepting the information. It's about internalizing it and making connections,
Yeah.
and then applying it in different contexts.
Mm.
So it's not just about knowing that different cultures have different approaches. It's about understanding the reasons behind those approaches and knowing that individual learners will be different even within the same cultural group.
Absolutely.
And we're going to explore how those cultural differences can impact our learning styles in even more practical ways. It part 2 of our deep dive, so make sure to tune in for that.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our exploration of how culture shapes learning. In part one, we talk about how cultural values like individualism versus collectivism and high versus low context communication can impact how people learn.
Yeah, and we saw how forgetting about those differences can lead to some real problems, like that Australian manager who
Yeah.
just couldn't get on board with that leadership training that was designed in Singapore.
Yeah.
But it's not just about avoiding those kinds of mishaps, is it?
No, not at all. It's about realizing the full potential of learning in a world where there are so many different cultures.
Right.
When we actually understand and value those differences, it makes the learning environment so much richer and more dynamic for everyone.
You know, that makes me think about your experience leading those training sessions in Germany during Ramadan.
Oh, yeah.
Just by thinking about your colleagues' cultural practices and changing up the schedule a bit, you made everyone feel included and respected.
Yeah, and it actually sparked some really interesting conversations about those cultural differences. And that actually turned into a learning experience for the whole team. It really showed me how cultural differences, which we often see as obstacles, can actually be strengths.
I love that. Thinking about those differences as opportunities to learn and grow,
Mm.
both individually and as a group.
Exactly. It's about moving from just tolerating those differences to actually appreciating them.
I like that.
And this actually brings us to another really interesting cultural dimension, time orientation. Hofstede's research showed how important this is in understanding how different cultures approach learning.
You know, I've always found that concept of time orientation so fascinating. Can you give us an example of how that plays out differently in, say, Japan versus the U.S.? I'm trying to picture two students, one in Tokyo and one in New York, both in a classroom. How would their cultural backgrounds affect how they learn?
That's a great question. In Japan, where they have that strong long-term orientation, you might see that student in Tokyo approaching their learning with a lot of patience and persistence. They might be more willing to do rote learning or repetitive tasks if they think it will help them master the material and lead to success in the future. It's all about delaying gratification, investing the effort now for rewards that might come years later.
So it's not just about getting a good grade on the next test. It's about building a strong foundation for lifelong learning and reaching those long-term goals.
That's right. Now think about that student in New York, in the US, where there's a stronger short-term orientation. They might be more focused on getting immediate results and putting that knowledge to use right away. They want to see how what they're learning connects to real life and how they can use it to solve problems they're facing right now.
So our New York student might be more drawn to hands-on activities or projects
Yeah.
where they can see what they're accomplishing and get feedback quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that neither orientation is better than the other. They just reflect different values and priorities.
Right.
But it does show how challenging it can be for educators who work with students from all sorts of backgrounds.
Yeah, if you have both long-term and short-term oriented learners in your classroom,
Sure.
how do you make a learning environment that works for everyone?
That's where the real skill of teaching comes in. It might mean finding ways to connect those long-term goals to benefits that students can see more immediately. You could also use a mix of teaching methods that work for different time orientations. Maybe offer quick practical exercises along with those longer research projects.
So it's about finding that balance,
Right.
recognizing those differences while still creating a learning experience that everyone shares.
Exactly.
This is making me think about Hofstede's other cultural dimensions. I'm curious to know how those affect learning too. Like, what about masculinity versus femininity?
Another great point. Remember, those terms aren't about traditional gender roles, but more about how cultures value certain traits.
Right.
In cultures that are more masculine, you often see an emphasis on achievement, competition, and assertiveness. These values can affect how people approach learning. They often put a lot of importance on individual performance and getting recognized for it.
So in a classroom that has those values, you might see students trying really hard to be the best and maybe even competing against each other more.
Yeah, and while that drive to succeed can be motivating for some students, it might make others feel stressed or intimidated. It's all about recognizing those different reactions and creating a learning environment that welcomes different ways of learning.
What about those cultures that are more feminine? How does that affect their approach to learning?
Feminine cultures often put more value on collaboration and building strong relationships. They focus on quality of life and well-being. In a learning environment, this means there's a bigger emphasis on cooperative learning empathy and creating a safe and supportive environment where everyone can contribute.
So it's about making people feel like they belong and valuing the process of learning as much as the outcome.
Exactly. And remember, these dimensions aren't just one or the other, they're more like a spectrum. Even in a culture that's more masculine, you'll find people who are more drawn to those feminine values and vice versa.
So going back to that challenge for educators, it's about making those flexible learning environments where both those competitive achievement-oriented learners and those who do better in a more collaborative, nurturing environment can succeed.
Right. And it's not just about making room for those differences, but about helping students understand and appreciate those different perspectives.
Yeah.
This brings us to something that often gets overlooked when we talk about learning styles, the power of adaptation.
Okay, I'm listening.
While we all might have our natural preferences for how we learn, research suggests we can actually get better at learning in different ways.
Hmm.
Think of it like a muscle that you can train. By trying out different learning experiences and teaching styles and being exposed to different cultural perspectives, we can actually expand our ability to learn.
So even if I've always thought of myself as a visual learner, I can actually get better at learning by listening or by doing things with practice. That's really encouraging.
It is. It shows how important it is to create learning environments that push students to step outside their comfort zones and try new things.
So for example, if you have students from collectivist cultures who might be really good at rote learning but have trouble with open discussions, you could give them chances to practice those discussion skills in a setting where they feel supported.
Exactly. Remember what those researchers said. There's no single best way to achieve a broad educational outcome, in large part because learners do not fit a single mold.
Yeah, I remember that. That's a really powerful statement.
It is.
Yeah.
And it takes the pressure off trying to find that one right way to learn and puts the focus on creating those rich and diverse learning environments where everyone can grow and thrive.
It's about meeting students where they are and giving them the tools and support they need to become adaptable, lifelong learners.
That's it.
Welcome back to our deep dive, where we've been looking at how culture and learning intersect. We've spent some time looking at those deep cultural values, the ones you can't always see at first glance, and how those impact how we understand and react to learning experiences.
Yes, and we also got into Hofstede's cultural dimensions and how things like time orientation or what he called masculine versus feminine values can affect everything from how comfortable a student is with asking a question to how they like to work together.
It's been really interesting. I think our listeners are ready now to go from thinking about this stuff to actually using it. We've explored the reasons behind cultural influences on learning. But how do we use this knowledge in our everyday lives?
That's the important part, isn't it?
Whether we're teachers or trainers or managers or just people living in a diverse world, what can we actually take away from all of this?
Moving from knowing to doing that, the challenge. Well, we've been saying throughout this whole deep dive that having cultural humility is so important. It doesn't mean you have to know everything about every culture, but it's about being really willing to learn and being open to challenging your own assumptions.
Right, realizing we all have blind spots that come from our own cultures and being ready for those moments when you go, oh, I was seeing that through my own cultural lens.
Exactly. And once you have that foundation of humility, you can start to develop those skills for navigating cultural differences in learning. One of the simplest but most effective strategies is just to ask questions. Don't be afraid to talk about those cultural differences, even if it feels a little awkward at first.
So if you're working with someone from a different cultural background, whether it's a coworker, a student, or even a friend, ask them about how they like to learn. Ask about their experiences in their home country, what they found helpful or challenging, what they're expecting from the learning environment they're in now.
And when you ask those questions, really listen to what they say. Be present, don't judge, don't interrupt. Pay attention to not just the words, but their body language and tone of voice. Remember our discussion on high context versus low context cultures. You might need to really focus on those small changes in how they act or how they sound to get the full meaning of what they're trying to say.
So it's like becoming a cultural detective, looking for those little clues and putting together a better understanding of how someone sees the world.
Right. And remember, communication goes both ways. It's not just about getting information, but also about sharing it in a way that's clear and considerate of their culture. Think about giving feedback, for example. In some cultures, direct criticism, even if you mean well, can come off as really rude.
So if you're working with someone from one of those cultures, you might need to change how you do things. Instead of pointing out what they need to improve, you could talk about what they're doing well and subtly suggest ways to grow.
Exactly. And this just shows how important it is to know the cultural norms around communication. For example, in some cultures, looking someone directly in the eye means you're being respectful and paying attention, but in other cultures, it can be seen as rude or challenging.
It's those little things that can make communication work or not.
Yeah, they can create those moments where things get lost in translation.
Exactly.
And it's not just about what we say. If you're a teacher or trainer, think about the visual aids you're using or the learning materials. Are they appropriate for the cultures of the people you're working with? Do they show a variety of viewpoints and experiences?
Right. Even a well-designed program can fail if it doesn't connect with the learner's cultural backgrounds, like that Australian team and that leadership program from Singapore.
Exactly. Cultural context is important. So if you're putting together learning materials, really try to see things from your audience's perspective. Think about where they come from, what they value, and what they've experienced. Like, if you're using humor, remember that what's funny in one culture might be offensive or confusing in another.
So it's not just about avoiding those cultural mistakes. It's about creating learning experiences that really engage everyone and make them feel included.
And a great way to do that is through storytelling. Stories have this amazing ability to cross cultural boundaries. They bring information to life and help us create memories that stay with us.
We love that.
If you're an educator, think about how you can add stories to your lessons. You could tell personal stories that relate to what you're teaching, invite speakers from different backgrounds, or even have your students share their own stories.
That's a great way to make learning more fun and interesting. And it helps people connect beyond just the textbook or the lecture.
Right.
It reminds us that learning isn't just about taking in information. It's about connecting with others, sharing and growing together.
And this brings up something really important. It's not just the teacher or trainer's job to create those culturally sensitive learning spaces.
Mhm.
Learners need to take charge of their own learning too.
How can we help them do that?
One way is to encourage them to think about their own cultural backgrounds and how those experiences might be shaping how they like to learn. You could ask them to think about how they were taught in their home countries, what their strengths and weaknesses are as learners, or even how their culture might be causing misunderstandings in their current learning environment.
So it's about helping them see those hidden cultural influences
Right.
and then encourage them to talk about those insights with their classmates.
Exactly. Create a learning community where everyone feels comfortable sharing their thoughts, asking questions, and learning from each other.
So it's about moving away from just the teacher being in charge to having the learners be more involved in shaping how they learn.
That's right. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to say, this exploration of culture and learning is something we do our whole lives. It's not a one-time thing.
Yeah, we're never going to have all the answers, and that's okay. The important thing is to stay curious, stay humble, and be open to learning from our experiences, both when things go well and when we make mistakes.
Making truly inclusive learning environments isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about helping everyone learn as much as they can. When we embrace cultural differences and make spaces where everyone feels seen, valued, and respected, that's when the magic happens.
It's about creating a love of learning that goes beyond those cultural boundaries and creates those moments of connection and understanding. Ultimately, it's about building a more just and fair world. Thank you for being with us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something valuable and that you have some practical ways to deal with the complex relationship between culture and learning.
Remember, this is a journey. What will you do to become a more culturally aware learner, educator, or leader? When we all work together to learn and grow, we all benefit